Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The vast and enigmatic Pacific Ocean, speckled with thousands of islands, is home to some of the most diverse and ancient cultures in human history. The region, often romanticized for its tropical beauty and unique traditions, has a lesser-known but deeply significant past, one marked by the presence of Black indigenous populations whose existence has been largely erased from mainstream narratives. The story of the Black natives of the Pacific Islands is one of resilience, survival, and, ultimately, systematic disappearance through centuries of colonial expansion, forced migration, cultural assimilation, and even outright extermination. While modern depictions of Pacific Islanders often emphasize Polynesians, there is a buried history of Melanesian and Papuan populations whose origins trace back tens of thousands of years. These groups, with their dark skin, curly hair, and distinct traditions, were among the earliest inhabitants of many of these islands. However, through the forces of European colonization, slave trading, intermarriage, and the suppression of their cultural identity, many of these groups have either diminished significantly or been completely absorbed into other populations. The disappearance of Black natives in the Pacific Islands is not just a historical tragedy, but an ongoing issue that raises questions about identity, historical erasure, and the fight for recognition. By delving into historical records, oral traditions, and anthropological evidence, this article seeks to piece together the untold story of these early Pacific dwellers and how their presence was gradually erased from the fabric of history. The earliest inhabitants of the Pacific Islands were the ancestors of today's Melanesians, a group of people whose lineage can be traced back to Africa through one of the oldest migrations of modern humans. Genetic studies indicate that around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, some of the first humans migrated out of Africa and settled in what is now Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and other parts of the Pacific. These early seafarers, known as the Austronesians and their predecessors, developed complex navigational techniques that allowed them to traverse vast oceanic distances, settling islands far and wide. Melanesians, in particular, were among the first to inhabit the islands of the Pacific. Their physical features, dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and distinct facial structures set them apart from the later arriving Polynesians and Asians. They created sophisticated societies, engaged in agriculture, and maintained deep-rooted traditions that would influence the cultural landscape of the region for millennia. However, the arrival of later waves of migration, particularly those of the Polynesians around 3,000 years ago, began a gradual shift in the demographic composition of the Pacific Islands. The Polynesians, coming from Southeast Asia, were lighter-skinned, with a different linguistic and cultural heritage. While intermarriage and coexistence were common, over time, the distinction between these groups became less defined as Polynesian dominance in the region grew. The arrival of European explorers in the Pacific, beginning with the Spanish and Portuguese in the 16th century, marked a turning point in the history of Black Pacific Islanders. European colonial powers viewed the indigenous peoples of the region as subjects to be exploited for labor, land, and resources. The darker-skinned Melanesians, in particular, were often categorized in racial hierarchies that deemed them inferior to both Europeans and the lighter-skinned Polynesians. During the 19th century, European and American traders, whalers, and missionaries increasingly infiltrated the Pacific, bringing with them not only new technologies and goods but also diseases that decimated indigenous populations. The Black natives of the Pacific were especially targeted in labor trade systems such as blackbirding, a form of coercion and kidnapping that saw thousands of Melanesians forced into servitude on plantations in Australia, Fiji, and other colonial territories. In many islands, indigenous cultures were systematically dismantled. Missionaries sought to convert native populations to Christianity, often discouraging or outright banning traditional practices. As colonial rule tightened, many darker-skinned Pacific Islanders were forcibly assimilated into broader Polynesian or European identities, erasing their distinct heritage. One of the most devastating impacts on the Black natives of the Pacific was the 19th century practice of blackbirding, a brutal labor trade that forcibly transported indigenous people from islands such as the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea to work in sugarcane fields in Australia and Fiji. The conditions in which these people were taken and forced to labor were akin to slavery, despite European claims that they were voluntary workers. Entire communities were depopulated, leaving behind fragmented families and lost cultural identities. Many of those who were taken never returned, their existence erased as they were assimilated into new societies or perished under harsh working conditions. The legacy of blackbirding remains a painful chapter in the history of the Pacific, with many descendants of these laborers still struggling for recognition and justice. As European influence in the Pacific expanded, so too did efforts to erase the cultural identity of Black Pacific Islanders. This was achieved through various means, including forced assimilation, intermarriage, and legal systems that marginalized darker-skinned populations. Colonial administrations often imposed strict racial classifications, favoring lighter-skinned Polynesians while relegating Melanesians to lower social standings. In some cases, entire languages and traditions were lost as indigenous people were encouraged, or forced, to adopt European names, languages, and customs. Education systems established by missionaries often discouraged the teaching of native histories, leaving future generations unaware of their true ancestry. Over time, this systematic erasure led to the near-total disappearance of distinct Black native identities in many parts of the Pacific. Despite centuries of erasure, the descendants of Black natives in the Pacific continue to fight for recognition and the preservation of their heritage. Efforts to reclaim indigenous identities have grown in recent decades, with communities in Melanesia, Australia, and other parts of the Pacific working to document their histories and revive cultural traditions. Today, genetic research and historical scholarship are helping to reconstruct the narratives that were lost. Organizations advocating for indigenous rights are pushing for better representation and acknowledgement of the role Black natives played in the development of Pacific societies. However, the struggle for recognition is ongoing, with many indigenous groups still facing discrimination and the effects of historical injustices. The disappearance of Black natives in the Pacific Islands is not just a story of the past, but a continuing issue that speaks to the broader themes of colonialism, racial hierarchies, and cultural erasure. Their history, though suppressed for centuries, remains embedded in the oral traditions, genetic legacies, and ongoing struggles of their descendants. By uncovering and amplifying these hidden histories, we take a step toward restoring the dignity and acknowledgement that Black Pacific Islanders deserve. Their contributions to the cultural and historical landscape of the Pacific should not be forgotten but honored as an integral part of the region's past, present, and future.